One of the questions that I have been getting as I've been giving talks about my book, Show Up Hard, is what is an empathy adventure? And can you give us some examples of one? I think it's a great question. Before I answer or we talk about what an empathy adventure is, let's start with why empathy. And empathy is needed for us to create change in the world. And whether that change is within ourselves, in a relationship with someone else, or more structurally in the world around us, it requires us to have empathy. And if we think about empathy, it's actually a muscle or a skill that can be built. There's research that shows that about 10% of our empathetic response is genetic, and the other 90% is from our lived experience and from the skill we build in the environment around us. So this is great news for those of us who think that we want to have more empathy in our life, or we want to have a more expansive repertoire of our empathy. So if we've identified that in order to create change, we need to have empathy, and we're maybe not satisfied with the level of empathy that we have in our life, and we know empathy is a muscle and it can be built. Also, I would add, if it's a muscle, it can atrophy, just like the muscles in our bodies if we don't use it. So I like to think about always having some sort of attention to empathy in my life and what level that muscle's at and what kind of tone and shape it has. And also to do that without judgment, that empathy can have different shapes and feels at different parts in our life. But in any case, if we know that empathy is needed, and what is one way that we could be building it? So one way that I gave myself permission, so to speak, to expand my empathetic experiences, probably about 10 years ago, I started referring to this with my BFF, Sandra, as stamping my passport. And this goes back to an idea, well, actually the love I had of traveling. When I was in college, I worked in Switzerland as part of a study abroad program, and we'd have a long weekend, and I'd love to go every weekend and travel about. And I would even sometimes look for unusual ways to travel with the hopes that I could get in another country and get another stamp in my passport. So whether I was in that, country for passing through, one night or a week, right? You still get the same stamp in your passport. And so there was something for me about collecting this proof that I had been somewhere, and part of my adventuring spirit, so to speak. And so in that way, I didn't have the same attachment to what would happen while I was there, or what that experience had to be like, or what that country had to be. But the process of just getting the stamp and the passport was something in and of itself. So if you think about this in terms of empathy adventures, if we release the expectation that things have to be a certain way, or we have to do things a certain way, or things have to turn out this way or that way, we think about stamping our passport, it really gives us permission to practice in a different way than we might otherwise. And so I created this worksheet, this Empathy Adventures Passport Worksheet. You can download it for free on the website. It's also a few of the pages in the book. And the Empathy Adventures Passport helps us to frame going on an empathy adventure. We define what the adventure is, we document what our internal narrative is, what are our assumptions and biases. Super important is noticing what goes on with our body, because one of the beauties of documenting and tracking these empathy adventures is we can start to understand the clues that our body gives us about how we show up and what happens for us in these empathetic adventures. And these clues can help inform us in the future. What are our takeaways from it? And then finally, how did I return to myself? And it's super important to figure out how we're going to get back to ourselves, so we know that we aren't going to get lost, because that can be one of our fears about going on an empathy adventure and breaking ourselves wide open, because there's a risk in doing that. Right? We risk that we're going to fall in love, that we're going to get changed, we're going to become a different person. And if we do it well, we will do all those things over and over again. But there's an inherent fear or risk that comes in setting out on such an adventure. And so if we mark a course that we can come back to ourselves, then we know we can come back to ourselves and integrate the experience so that we can keep showing up hard for others. And I created this passport with lots of room for writing, because writing, I think, is an important practice and part of doing the work. One, it slows us down so that we can notice things. But two, the process of writing itself helps us to integrate these experiences so they become part of the fabric of who we are and how we show up in the world. So what are some examples of empathy adventures? Well, there's these kind of low-hanging fruit opportunities for empathy adventures, which would be reading a book or watching a movie that's about a character or a worldview that's wildly different from our own. And I bet we've all experienced this in a book that we just can't stop thinking about, or how a movie might rally people to change their mind or get involved or become part of a cause. And one little asterisk I would have to say about this is that so much of the dominant culture and popular movies and books are still written in a way that keep people who have privilege comfortable. So the empathy adventure is not really a stretch. I'm going to say it might be more like sympathy. And there's a big difference between sympathy and empathy when we actually get down to creating change, like some kind of measurable evaluation of that process. So if the dominant culture is kept really comfortable by this narrative, then it's probably not an actual empathy adventure. And so one thing we can do is do some research about who wrote the book or who produced or wrote the movie, and what do people who have the lived experience of that book or movie say about this piece of literature, this film. The point of an empathy adventure is that we uncenter ourselves. We have to uncenter ourselves from the narrative so that we can go through the lived experience and see the world through someone else's eyes. So movies and books can be like low barrier, low cost, low time investment ways of expanding our empathy. And then there's other ways that are kind of short time investments and not as big of a risk of engaging with people in person too. And I talk about some of these on page 64 of the book in Empathy is an Adventure, chapter 4 in book 1. And there's some examples in there, I would say, of like low commitment and low time or short time ways that we can engage with people in person and have an empathy adventure. So we can have conversations with people during our commute, in coffee shops or in public places about books that they're reading, newspaper articles they're reading, a current event, the local current event, with the only goal of listening and seeing what the other person thinks. We can also have volunteer experiences, and there's lots of ways to have one-off volunteer experiences this is at film festivals or sports events or at nonprofits. And a bonus would be to check out what are the unattractive slots that no one else is signing up for and wonder why, and sign up for those and see what kind of magic you find in those places. And again, if we go on those adventures with the goal of uncentering ourselves and not being the hero of the story and seeing what we can learn, those are ways we can dip in and out of different places, make a contribution, but also expand our empathy muscle. So I hope that these have been some helpful ideas to, like, one, give you permission, prompt you to get started. You can download the worksheet for free on the website. And also there's a free 30-day e-course on the website, which I had so much fun making. And so you don't need the book to be able to access these tools and start building that muscle and going on adventures of your own. So I thought I would share about 2 empathy adventures that I had recently. And one would be that I was able to connect with a family member that I'm not as close with. I come from a big family. You can't be close with everyone. And we made a date to chat about a book that we had read. And in doing so, I was able to note the internal narrative, the assumptions and biases that I had about this family member and how they might respond to the book. And it was this beautiful experience of connection, and I learned so much from it. And I would say, it took maybe 30 or 40 minutes of time, and we are close in a new way, but there was something very magical about setting myself up for that experience by setting aside any goals or certain outcome that had to come from the phone call, and just being present and listening to their experience. And second would be an empathy adventure that rocked my world in a deeper way, is that I received a call from a colleague a couple weekends ago asking me to help a friend of hers in crisis. And as I assessed what time I had available, I was actually very available to help, and I really wanted to help. And it was also an adventure that I had not been on in a long time. And so even as I start to talk about it with you now, my heart beats a little bit faster, because what happens is how quickly comes in the story I tell myself about what I'm supposed to be and what's supposed to happen in this story. And it's actually the empathy adventure I wrote about on this passport worksheet, because it was so important for me to write down and integrate that experience that I couldn't stop thinking about probably for a week. And I absolutely returned from profoundly changed. I hope in a way that I'll be accountable to doing my work in a better way and creating change for women in healthcare in a better way. But what was beautiful for me in being able to, one, go on that adventure, and two, write about it, was bumping into the stories I tell myself and the biases that I have, and being reminded to take a look at these things and slow it all down so that I can be there and create change in the way that I would like to. I hope this has been helpful. I would love to hear what empathy adventures you are on, and if there's any way that I can support you in building that empathy muscle. Have a great week.